Rain had softened the earth around Maple Ridge, turning fallen leaves to mush and making even the gravel roads slick with mud. The old fence posts that once marked the perimeter of the McKinley farm stood like crooked teeth, barely visible under a tangle of blackberry vines and years of neglect. 7-year-old Autumn Walker wasn't supposed to be this far out. She knew that. Her dad had made it clear. Stick to the trails behind their house, don't wander near the old properties, and be home before lunch. But the maple leaves here were brilliant, deep crimson and copper, glowing against the gray Oregon sky. They were perfect for her school project, and she was determined to gather the best ones. So when her boots slipped on the wet slope and she tumbled through the brush, landing hard on her knees, she didn't cry. She just sat there for a moment, catching her breath. That's when she heard it. A sound low and broken. A whimper. Her breath hitched. She froze. It was an animal, and it wasn't far. Autumn's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind spun back 2 years, to the sound of snarling teeth, the blur of fur lunging from behind a parked truck, the feel of sharp pain tearing into her forearm. That dog had been smaller, scruffier, but the fear, the full-body freeze, came rushing back all the same. Another whimper. Then silence. She stood, every instinct screaming for her to turn around and run. But something in that sound, the weakness of it, the way it wasn't angry but hurting, made her take a cautious step forward. And then another. Pushing aside a curtain of brambles, she saw it. The dog was massive, a German shepherd, mostly tan with patches of black. Its body twisted in the underbrush. One of its hind legs was caught in a coil of rusted barbed wire, the kind that once kept livestock penned in. Blood stained its fur, mixing with the mud. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. Autumn's stomach turned. Her palms were sweating. But the dog didn't growl, didn't bark. Just looked at her with amber eyes that held no threat, only exhaustion. "I'll get help," she whispered, backing away slowly. She ran, leaves and mud flying under her boots. Back at the house, Mason Walker was crouched under the porch, fixing a warped step with a power drill that refused to cooperate in the damp. His back ached more than usual, but he didn't complain. He never did. When he heard Autumn's frantic footsteps squelching up the trail, he looked up, alarmed. "Autumn!" Her cheeks were flushed, hair soaked from the drizzle, eyes wide with something more than fear. There's a dog," she panted. "It's stuck in wire. It's hurt." Mason was already moving. She led him back with urgency in her steps, the fear forgotten, or buried deep enough for now. When they reached the underbrush, Mason crouched low, his movements instinctual, practiced. The dog didn't move, but his ears twitched at Mason's approach. "Easy, buddy," Mason said, his voice low. The same calm he'd once used in a war zone. "You're going to be all right." He examined the injury quickly. The wire had bitten deep, but not beyond saving. The dog's tags were worn, but still visible. His fingers brushed the metal plates and froze. "Military issue," he muttered. "K9. Like Army. Like you?" Autumn asked, barely above a whisper. "Looks like it," Mason said, glancing back at her. "Probably part of a special ops unit." He took out a multi-tool from his belt and began cutting the wire carefully, working not to startle the dog. But the shepherd didn't resist, just lay there, watching Autumn. "You okay standing here?" Mason asked. Autumn nodded, though her fists were clenched tight. It took 15 minutes to free the dog. As Mason lifted it carefully into the back of the truck, Autumn climbed in beside it without being asked. The vet clinic in Crestwood was 40 minutes away. Mason made the call on the drive, explaining the situation in clipped, military-toned sentences. Dr. Helen Ramirez was waiting when they arrived. "He's dehydrated, and the leg needs stitching," she said after a quick examination. "He's chipped. Let me check." She scanned the tag. A beep. Her brow furrowed. Well? Mason asked. Dr. Ramirez looked up. It's encrypted. Military database. Handler classified. Unit classified. The only thing not locked down is his designation, Ghost. Autumn, who had been silent the whole time, repeated the name softly. Ghost! The dog lifted his head weakly at the sound of his name, his eyes finding hers. And that's when it happened. Autumn, without trembling, reached out slow, deliberate, and brushed her fingers against his fur. No panic. No tears. Just connection. Mason saw it. He said nothing, but inside, something shifted. He knew ghosts. He carried plenty. But maybe this one, just maybe, had come for a reason. The fog clung low over Maple Ridge the next morning, curling between the moss-covered trees and settling on the shingles of the old Walker cabin like breath held too long. Autumn stood by the window, her small hands curled around a mug of hot cocoa, watching the mist swirl through the woods. Her father sat silently at the table, flipping through paperwork for jobs he hadn't yet decided whether he could actually do. His limp was worse with the spring damp, his mind still not always cooperating. "Can we go see him today?" Autumn asked, her voice soft but steadier than usual. Mason looked up. He didn't need to ask who she meant. "Yeah, kiddo. As soon as we finish breakfast." They made the trip to Crestwood in quiet. At the clinic, Dr. Ramirez greeted them with a tired but hopeful smile. Ghost stable. The legs stitched and wrapped, though it's going to be a while before he can walk normally. We're keeping him on antibiotics and pain meds for now. She led them to the recovery kennel. Ghost lay curled on a padded blanket, his eyes opening slowly as they approached. Autumn took a step forward. Ghost's ears twitched. Then he lifted his head. Autumn didn't flinch. She sat cross-legged outside the kennel, not speaking, just watching. Ghost's tail tapped once against the floor. And for a moment, Mason wasn't watching a scared little girl. He was watching someone who understood pain sitting beside someone who carried it too. 2 years earlier, things had been different. Autumn used to chase butterflies behind the elementary school, her laughter ringing through the meadows like bells. That was before the crash. Before the dog attack that left her arm in stitches and her dreams stained with snarling jaws. After her mom died, something inside Autumn shut down. The fear of dogs, already buried deep after the attack, grew into a monster with long claws. She'd scream if one barked down the street. She'd cross roads to avoid leashed puppies. Therapy helped, but slowly, painfully. Mason hadn't known what to do. He'd survived combat zones and buried friends, but nothing prepared him for watching his daughter shrink into herself. His own PTSD made it worse. Nights of pacing in the dark, sweat-drenched sheets, flashbacks he couldn't describe. They were a household of shadows and unspoken grief, trying to navigate mornings with stiff smiles and routines that barely held them together. Ghost changed something. Each day after school, Autumn asked to visit the clinic. She never got too close. Not at first. Just sat outside the kennel and read aloud children's books, adventure stories. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it never shook. And Ghost listened. He watched her with those intelligent eyes, ears perking at the sound of her voice. He never barked, never made sudden moves. He just lay there, still but attentive, as if waiting for something. On the 5th day, something shifted. Autumn held out her hand. Ghost sniffed it gently. She didn't pull away. "Look," Dr. Ramirez whispered from the hallway. That's the first time she's let him touch her. Mason didn't answer. Mason swallowed hard, his throat tight. Back in town, things weren't as peaceful. Maple Ridge had been buzzing for weeks about the stray dog problem. The spring rains had driven animals from the woods into the edges of town. Thin, skittish creatures that rifled through trash cans and set off porch motion lights. Some residents wanted them rounded up and put down. Others, like Miss Carver from the diner and Sheriff Jenkins, advocated for catch-and-release programs or temporary shelters. The latest town hall meeting had ended in shouting. People were scared. Others were angry. When word got around that Mason Walker's daughter had rescued a wild dog, it added fuel to the fire. "Military or not," said Tom Daniels at the general store, "that thing's still dangerous. Look at the size of it." "He's not dangerous," Autumn told her teacher quietly when she overheard her classmates repeating it. "He's sad." Later that week, Dr. Ramirez called Mason into her office. She closed the door behind him and folded her arms. "I've been digging into Ghost's microchip info," she said. "The encryption isn't civilian. This is Black Ops level." Mason raised an eyebrow. "He was registered under a Special Operations K-9 unit," she continued. "Classified records. But I have contacts. He disappeared during a mission over 8 months ago. The report says presumed dead, or unrecoverable." Mason leaned back. "And now he's lying in your kennel, bleeding and broken." "Exactly," which raises a big question. How did a classified military dog end up abandoned in barbed wire near an old farm in Maple Ridge? Mason didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the hallway, where Autumn sat beside Ghost, her fingers brushing his fur. "I don't know," he said finally. "But maybe he came back for a reason." The thaw of spring brought a fragile kind of peace to Maple Ridge. The kind that tiptoes in quietly, careful not to disturb the ghost still lingering beneath the surface. Mason Walker noticed it in the softer light streaming through the kitchen window, in the way the snowmelt turned the hills into trickling streams. And most of all, in Autumn, she was changing. Each morning now, she'd step out onto the porch with Ghost, their German shepherd shadow moving beside her like a silent guardian. The dog had gone from stranger to presence, from threat to anchor. There were no more panicked steps backward, no more flinch at the sound of claws on wood. Instead, Mason often found them side by side. Autumn reading aloud with quiet concentration while Ghost listened, head resting against her knee, eyes half closed in something that almost resembled peace. It unsettled Mason in ways he didn't admit out loud. Ghost was a military working dog, a product of war, trained for obedience, for precision, for aggression when called. Mason had known dogs like him overseas. Loyal to the bone, yes, but forged in chaos. What happened when instinct kicked in? When an old command slipped through the cracks of memory? But Autumn was different too. It was in the way she stood a little taller when she brushed Ghost's fur, in how she'd begun raising her hand at school, speaking more. Her eyes no longer darted to every shadow. She still had hard days, but the silence wasn't consuming her anymore. And Mason, watching it all, found himself caught in a current of conflicting emotions, pride, worry, hope, and fear, pulling him in opposite directions. The moment of proof came unexpectedly, as they often do. The elementary school hosted Community Connections Day, and Autumn, to Mason's surprise, asked to participate. He'd expected something small, a drawing perhaps, but on the day of the event, she stood in front of the gymnasium, holding Ghost's leash with trembling hands, and began to speak. Her voice quavered at first, but steadied with every word. "I used to be scared of dogs," she said, her gaze flickering across the gathered crowd. "After the accident, after everything, I thought I'd always be afraid. But then we found Ghost. He was scared too. He got hurt. We help each other now." She rested a hand on the dog's back. "He listens even when I don't talk out loud." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Miss Reynolds wiped at her eyes. A few parents nodded. Others leaned in, whispering quietly. Ghost, unmoved by the attention, remained still calm, the model of restraint. Later that afternoon, the quiet was broken again. Not by applause, but by the low rumble of an unfamiliar SUV pulling into the vet clinic's gravel lot. Mason had dropped by to check on Ghost's leg. He arrived just in time to see the man step out of the vehicle. He was tall, with a regulation cut that hadn't softened with discharge. His boots still carried the posture of command, even in civilian clothes. But it was Ghost who noticed first. His ears flattened. His entire body went rigid. Dr. Ramirez met the man at the reception counter. Cautious but professional. "Looking for the shepherd?" she asked. The man nodded. "I'm Sergeant Trevor Lane. I was his handler." Ghost. His designation was Echo. "He's government property. I've come to reclaim him." Mason stepped closer, arms crossed. He watched Ghost, who hadn't moved. No wag. No reaction. Lane walked toward the kennel and issued a command. "Echo, stand." Ghost stayed still. Lane tried again, sharper this time. Still nothing. And then something changed. Ghost let out a soft whine. Not of recognition, but of something else. Mason couldn't name it, but it made his stomach turn. Lane's jaw tightened. "You've ruined him." "No," Mason said, his voice low. "We gave him something better." A shuffle at the door. Autumn had come in, her small frame still damp from the drizzle outside. She froze as she spotted the stranger, then looked to Ghost. Their eyes met, and Ghost moved, not to Lane, to her. He walked past the man who had once given him orders, past the voice he'd once obeyed, and sat at Autumn's side, his head tilted upward, ears alert, posture relaxed but protective. Lane stared, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. Without a word, he turned and left. Outside, the rain deepened. Inside, Ghost leaned against Autumn's side. And Mason knew, with clarity as sharp as mountain air, that the dog had made his choice. Ghost had taken his last command and rewritten it on his own terms. Rain had become a relentless rhythm in Maple Ridge for days. It had fallen without pause, drumming on rooftops, swelling rivers, and turning the dirt roads into veins of mud. Mason watched the weather updates with a soldier's gaze, focused, calculating. Years of deployment had taught him that when nature shifts, you listen. And nature, it seemed, was shouting. Downstairs, Autumn pulled on her yellow rain jacket, the hood too big for her small frame. She stuffed a walkie-talkie into her pocket, the same one her dad had given her after Ghost entered their lives. It had become a lifeline in more ways than one. At the far edge of town, temporary rescue tents were erected for the animals displaced by the rising creek. Miss Harrow, the town's elderly shelter volunteer, had put out a call for help, and Autumn had begged to join the effort. Mason had hesitated, of course, his protective instinct stronger than ever. But Ghost's presence had become a buffer between fear and freedom. Eventually, Mason gave in, with one condition. She had to stay in the marked zone and check in every 15 minutes. By late afternoon, the sky darkened unnaturally, a deep charcoal ceiling pressing down on the mountains. Then came the alert. An emergency broadcast pierced through radios and phones alike. Flash flood warning. Mandatory evacuations. Chaos stirred in town as people rushed to higher ground. But Autumn and Ghost had gone radio silent. Mason's heart dropped. He tried the walkie-talkie again. "Autumn, do you copy?" "Over." Only static replied, with urgency hardwired. Mason threw on his coat, grabbed his gear, and jumped into his truck. The old Ford roared to life and tore down the wet road, tires slicing through puddles as he made his way toward the animal rescue tents, the last place she said she'd be. The roads were already half submerged by the time he reached the clearing near the old Miller farm. Emergency crews were clearing out. A volunteer recognized him and ran over. "She was here earlier," the man shouted over the rain. "Said she heard barking near the drainage line. She went with the dog to check it out." The blood drained from Mason's face. There was only one drainage line in that area. A concrete tunnel running beneath the old highway, known to clog during storms. Ghost's training might keep them safe, but if the water rose faster than expected, Mason didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight and sprinted toward the tunnel path, slipping down the embankment. His boots sank into mud as the current rushed around his ankles. In the distance, a flicker of movement, then a faint sound. A child's voice crying. "Autumn!" he yelled. No answer. His light swept through the mouth of the tunnel, where shadows shifted and the water whirled violently. Then he saw her, curled against the tunnel wall, soaked and shivering. Autumn clung to Ghost, who stood guard like a statue despite a visible gash on his shoulder. The dog's body shielded hers from the worst of the current. His ears were pricked, his muscles coiled, ready to defend her from whatever came next. Even the river itself. Mason moved without thinking. The water now reached mid-thigh, pulling hard. "Stay with me, Ghost," he whispered as he approached, hand out. Ghost didn't growl. He simply looked at him and stepped aside, allowing Mason to scoop Autumn into his arms. Her face pressed against Mason's chest, sobbing. "He wouldn't leave me," she cried. Even when the water got high, he stayed. Mason reached out and grabbed Ghost by the harness. The dog stumbled, clearly hurt, but stayed upright. Together, they pushed back through the tunnel, muscles straining against the torrent. They emerged just as the storm sirens blared louder. A chopper was incoming. Rescue teams had spotted them. A rope ladder dropped, swaying in the wind. One of the paramedics waved them over from a rescue boat below. Mason secured Autumn first, strapping her into the safety harness. She protested weakly, reaching for Ghost. "I'm not leaving without him." The rescue team hesitated. Rules and regulations didn't account for military dogs and terrified children. But Ghost made the decision for them. With the last strength in his injured limbs, he stepped into the harness beside her, pressing his body against Autumn's side. As if to say, "We go together or not at all." The pair were lifted into the sky as the water surged below, the chopper blades chopping the storm into wild gusts. Mason watched them rise, relief flooding him, until a shape moved in the corner of his vision. A man, soaked to the bone, watching. Trevor Lane. His eyes locked with Mason's, cold and determined. Then he turned and melted into the rain-soaked forest. Lane hadn't come to help. He'd come for Ghost, and he was willing to wait. Back at the emergency shelter, as doctors examined Autumn and Ghost was taken in for immediate surgery, Mason stood by silently, fists clenched. The town had rallied to help his daughter. Now it was his turn to protect the dog who had done the same. The storm passed, but its mark lingered in Maple Ridge like a bruise on skin not yet healed. Roads were ripped apart, homes soaked to their foundations. The creek that once meandered quietly through the valley had carved a new path, violent, merciless. But the town endured, and at the edge of it all, in a small veterinary clinic tucked beneath the mountain ridge, a German shepherd fought for his life. Autumn sat curled in the waiting room chair, her knees pulled up to her chest. She hadn't spoken much since the rescue. Not because she was afraid, she wasn't, not anymore, but because she'd said all that mattered already. Back in that tunnel, when she whispered to Ghost, "Please stay." Now she waited to see if he would. Dr. Ingrid Flores stepped into the room, her scrubs wrinkled from hours in surgery. She looked exhausted, but when she met Autumn's eyes, she offered a soft smile. "He made it," she said, "but just barely." Autumn stood so quickly the chair skidded back with a squeak. Dr. Flores continued. The injury on his leg reopened during the flood. There was internal bleeding, some damage to his spine. But he's stable now. Mason stepped forward. "What about his future? Will he walk again?" The doctor hesitated, then shook her head. "It's too soon to say. There's a chance he'll regain mobility, but it's just as likely he'll have a permanent limp. He won't be cleared for active service again. That chapter is over. Good, Autumn whispered. He doesn't belong to that life anymore. 3 days passed. Ghost remained in intensive care, hooked to 4 fluids and pain meds, eyes half closed, but tracking every movement Autumn made when she visited. She sat beside him every afternoon, reading aloud from her favorite books, her voice soft, steady. Ghost would twitch his ears at certain words. At others, he let out low, contented sighs. Then came the knock on the clinic door. Mason opened it to find 2 men in uniform, military police. "We're here for the dog," one of them said. "Trevor Lane is in custody. Official investigations underway. But the dog remains government property." Mason didn't move. He's not a soldier anymore. The officer checked his clipboard. "We're aware. That's why we're initiating his transfer into the military K-9 retirement program." Dr. Flores joined them, arms crossed. "He needs time and a safe place to recover." The younger officer nodded. "Agreed, which is why we're recommending permanent placement. Mr. Walker, you're on the approved list of veteran handlers. If you're willing, Ghost can be transferred into your care, fully retired." Autumn, standing behind her father, held her breath. Mason looked at his daughter, then at the clinic room where Ghost rested, wrapped in blankets. "You really think he'd do better somewhere else?" The officer didn't answer. Mason stepped aside. "Then he stays with us." 2 months later, spring arrived early. The hills around Maple Ridge turned green again, stubbornly, as if the flood had never happened. But its memory was stitched into every repaired bridge, every new root planted in fresh soil. And stitched into the heart of the town was a building that hadn't existed before. The Ridge Haven Center for Animal Recovery and Rescue, a modern, sunlit space just off the highway, built on donated land, funded by local efforts and military grants. Ghost became the first official resident, not as a patient, but as a teacher. He no longer ran. Not like before. His right hind leg still dragged slightly, and stairs were a slow endeavor. But he held his head high, eyes clear, and wore a new vest, therapy dog in training. Autumn had helped design it. She was now the face of the center, its youngest volunteer, its loudest advocate. Her fear of dogs, once paralyzing, had been replaced with something fierce and protective. She spoke at school assemblies. She helped train other rescue animals. She even taught Ghost a few tricks of her own. At the grand opening, townspeople gathered beneath a banner that read, "Second chances live here." Mason stood beside Autumn as she approached the microphone, her voice carrying further than it ever had before. "When I first met Ghost, I was afraid of him," she said. "But he wasn't afraid of me. He stayed with me in the dark, even when he was hurt. He didn't follow orders anymore. He followed his heart. And because of that, I'm not afraid anymore. Not of dogs. Not of storms. Not of being alone." She looked down at Ghost, who sat at her feet. "He saved me, and now we save others." As the crowd applauded, Mason felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't defined by what he had lost. He had a mission again, heading the town's new emergency response unit, training with Ghost, coordinating rescue efforts with the center. Purpose had returned. After the ceremony, Autumn sat on the center's new porch, the evening sun painting the hills gold. Ghost rested his head in her lap. She ran her fingers through the fur behind his ears. "You don't have to be a soldier anymore," she whispered. "You're home." Ghost's eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time in his life, he slept, not because he was tired, but because he was safe. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.